This is the PowerPoint presentation for Humanities 213, Week 3. This week we look at the Aegean cultures, the beginning of Greek culture and the emergence of the individual. Corresponding to Chapter 4 in Fierro's textbook, pages 76 through 86A, 89B, dealing with the Olympic Games, and pages 100 through 101. We will cover the rest of Chapter 4 when we cover classical Greece in a couple of weeks. This week, the lecture focuses on the Aegean cultures. We will look at background developments for ancient Greece, going all the way back to the Neolithic, just to set the stage and look at some early developments. Briefly, we will look at then the Cycladic culture and then move to Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, the last phase of Old Europe civilization. And then we'll look at Mycenaean civilization, the Bronze Age Greeks. Then we'll have a section on the Greek hero, and toward the end of that section look at heroic language in the New Testament and early Christianity. Then we'll briefly look at archaic Greek history, and then we'll note the Greek deities separated into Olympian and Chthonian deities, and then finally early Greek philosophy. It's important to delineate the major periods of Greek history. We are primarily, in this lecture, going to look at the Mycenaean Greek period, that is before 1200 BC, and in the Bronze Age. The geographical center is the Greek Peloponnesus, which you'll see on the next slide. And then there is a Dark Age interval, and then follows archaic and classical Greece, which take place in the Iron Age after 800 BC. And important especially is the city of Athens. Here's a map of Greece with some important locations noted on it. We have on the left part the Greek mainland, and note at the southern part of the Greek mainland there is a little hand figure isthmus that is barely connected at the city of Corinth. That larger mass just barely connected to the mainland is the Peloponnese, or the Peloponnesus. Very important to the period we're about to cover. To the right, that is to the east, you see the Aegean Sea, which separates Greece from the west coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and there are many, many islands in that region. You see down at the southern part of the map the large island running horizontally from our perspective of Crete, the island of Crete. So this is the world we're going to look at right now, especially focusing on the Peloponnesus and the islands in the Aegean Sea. For this period in Greek history, among other sources, very valuable to me has been the classic work by Emily Vermeule, Greece in the Bronze Age, and Walter Burkett's Greek Religion. Now we're speaking of the Greek region. We can't speak of Greece as a nation at all at this point. In fact, I'm going to begin this in the Neolithic. Early on, the Greek area was forested, but goats and humans eventually cleared a lot of the forests. A lot of game, such as red deer, fallow deer, and wild boar, as well as fishing. And the ocean is going to be very important to the Greeks. Nicomid Nea Nicomedia in Macedonia, up north of Greece proper, is the oldest Neolithic village yet discovered. It was a farming community, carbon-14 dating it around 6200 BC. Domesticated wheat and barley, goats and sheep. What do we find in the Neolithic? What we find in other areas of Anatolia and Europe. These feminine figurines. A key indication or a key artifact of the Neolithic. This fertile earth mother was worshipped in all of Greece, in Anatolia, and the Near East, deeply rooted in the agricultural life of these places. And these are often associated with caves. And we've already covered this kind of thing. And we know that feminine figurines, in fact, go back, according to the archaeologists or the anthropologists, tens of thousands of years. Very much what others have called certainly a focus on the feminine and perhaps a matriarchal kind of society. But alas, we have no handbooks. We can only use our reason and come up with theories. Vermeule notes two important Greek Neolithic sites that occurred late in the Neolithic. You can see the dates there. Because when you compare them, something is happening the one after the other. At Sesklo, which you can find on the map I've supplied, around 4800 BC, and she indicates that this is really typical of Neolithic sites. About 20 small houses for around 150 people. And we should keep in mind that these small communities probably are very much revolve around, clans, families. There were hearths in the interiors of the houses. We might call them fireplaces. And outside of the houses were domed ovens for baking bread and perhaps firing pottery. They were shepherds and farmers and fishermen. The diet of wheat and barley, beans and peas, figs and pears, but even grapes and olives. They utilized obsidian, which was not locally found. The best obsidian came from the island of Melos in the Cyclades, which you can find on the map, and thus very strong seafaring people somewhere around there supplying this material. We actually find inscribed images of the boats or ships. Sesklo had good quality painted pottery, no evidence of bows and arrows, and the feminine figurines in the caves were important. About 800 years later, there's the close by Dimini site. Now they have bows and arrows by this time, and they are more martial in disposition. That is, showing a little more war consciousness. Their art is less distinguished. It's of a lesser quality. The pottery, the art on the pottery. And they build ringed fortifications with a large rectangular building in the middle, known as a megaron, or big house. And they introduce the main point with this comparison of Sesklo and Dimini is to see that a change is occurring. Now, whether what's going on at Dimini is related to what will be the future Greeks, Mycenaean Greeks, we're not sure. But we'll see the big house appearing, the ringed fortifications, continuing and developing. Just like in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Neolithic is followed by the beginning of the Bronze Age. And this Bronze Age does correspond to the Bronze Age going on in Egypt and Mesopotamia. You can see the dates here. The 3rd millennium BC is the period of time between 2 and 3000 BC. So there are peoples in the area of Greece who are developing a culture that is parallel in time to the other side of the Mediterranean, when Egypt is building pyramids and Sargon the Great is ruling in Mesopotamia. Bronze metallurgy is introduced to this area, which implies distant trading, and must have quite a bit been by sea. We see the continuing development in this early Bronze Age in Greece, fortified coastal settlements, accommodating storage facilities and central main buildings. Remember, when we want to look at the development of a civilization, we start noting any surplus storage facilities may indicate something of that. The town of Lerna is usually given as the model for this period, with its great house of tiles in the center of its fortified settlement. And Vermeil relates the fortification and the growing central house and the storage facilities as part of an ongoing concentration of local power. Interesting to note that. It's clear that women were active weaving. Lots of loom weights have been found in the finds. The presence of so many seals indicate private property, right? Sealing on pottery and other things would indicate ownership. And we note the swirling curves or spirals that I mentioned in the previous slide occurring on these seals. On this slide, Vermeil notes the elements that we've been following of what make up a civilization and relates it to what is going on the within the Greek area. Important at this time is the Cycladic island culture of the Aegean Sea. You can see the dates. It's running contemporaneous with this early Bronze Age and of the Greeks, and spills over into their Middle Bronze. But you have to go back to the introduction in your book, pages 7 through 8, to read about these figures, and you have a picture on figure 0.9. Here again are feminine figurines, very stylized, usually about 8 inches in height, but a couple were more than 5 feet high. And these are made of fine marble, because that's where you find fine marbles in the Cyclades. Is it a mother goddess, like the woman of Willendorf, which we looked at in the Stone Age presentation? These are abstractions. Vermeil and others believe there's some connection to the Mother Earth concept because of where they are found in tombs, perhaps again fertility implied, and we're back to that concept. The tomb is a womb. Thus, the Cycladic statuettes, which we see in figure 0.9, the woman of Willendorf, the megalithic tombs, and cave paintings may reflect ideas about fertility. And recall the UCLA archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, who held that the Aegean region, the area we're studying right now, was a last stand of old Europe civilization, especially when we get to Minoan Crete. Around the transition to the Greek late Bronze Age are found the important shaft graves at Mycenae, in circles B and A, and you see the dates there. wherein, as Vermeil describes it, there's great depth with a wooden roof, multiple gifts and bodies, carved stelae, and the passion for being buried under a heap of gold with armor and masks. And one of the treasures found in the shaft graves at Mycenae is the mask of Agamemnon. It's not actually Agamemnon's mask, but that was the name given it. Also found in the tombs were bulls' heads and double axes, and thus it's still transitioning from the old. Still has some of the relics or the artifacts of what one might find in a more feminine deity-based culture. Now, the stelae found, that is various steles, stone slabs, upright stone slabs, they do have martial themes. So this culture is interested in things like horses and chariots and hunts. In fact, Vermeil believes by this time we can begin speaking of a warrior aristocracy at Mycenae. However, we also note that this appears to be somewhat a continuation of the fortified village with the central large building and storage facilities. At this point, Vermeil can speak of the people of this shaft grave culture as follows. There is a pattern of life that the shaft grave warriors must have known to some extent, a life of raids, aristocratic battle training, and the amassing of portable loot to astonish any Middle Helladic farmer. They knew how to exploit local metals and metal technology. They had the training in new war techniques, the battle chariot and the long sword, to be pretty redoubtable in violent conflict. They had the intelligence to capitalize on trade with newly affluent Mediterranean regions, and they seem to have been fearless in foreign contact. Leaving the Greek mainland, we now go to the southern Greek island, the large island of Crete. The culture found there at this time has been labeled Minoan, named after the mythological king Minos, who is known from the Greek mythological tale of the hero Theseus, Ariadne, and the Minotaur in the labyrinth on Crete. The main city was Knossos, which was heavily populated. Crete thrived on an import-export economy. They exported olive oil and wine and pottery, gold and silver cups, jewelry and precious metal vases, while importing other foodstuffs. Most important to note about Minoan Crete, they had a lack of enemies, and this was indicated by unwalled cities. There are no fortifications. They have no record of any wars. Even their art lacks a martial aspect, and the culture in general lacked a martial aspect. But it fell about 1380 BC without a struggle to the Mycenaean Greeks, the ones we're looking at the culture developing on the Greek mainland. Before the fall of Minoan Crete, though, they seem to have gotten along pretty well with the Mycenaean Greeks. But anyway, here is this culture that is safe from enemies, at least up until the Mycenaean Greeks, and yet it did not fall with the battle. The outstanding architectural achievement of Crete, Minoan Crete, was the palace at Knossos, which covered 3 acres and had large storage facilities. The dates given there are the dates for its building, when it was built. The palace could be described as labyrinthine, a complex layout of rooms and passages. The word labyrinth itself means house of the double axe, and these double axes were found in various places. They have in fact been now related to some form of goddess cult. You can see a picture of a part of the palace at figure 4.2 in your book, as well as the interior at 4.3. And my next note is that they utilized an inverted column. In other words, it's larger at the top and then it tapers downward, with a pillow-like cushion for its capital being the top part of the column. And then there are the wall frescoes, such as you see in figure 4.3 and 4.4. Not war scenes, but rather playful in ways. And figure 4.4 shows the famous, what appears to be bull leaping going on. I've already mentioned the importance of bulls in the lectures. What is the importance of the bull here? Well, we know that the bull horns, again, are part of this feminine cult. Whether the bull leaping is related to that or not, certainly I'm not sure. But you can see the colorful, playful themes involved with Minoan art. They really do lack a warrior-like attitude and do not express much fear in their cultural artifacts. Here's another view of the Palace of Knossos. Note again on the white inverted column, and then on the left you can see the bull horns, sometimes called the horns of consecration. And in fact, between the two horns there are pictures of the double axe being inserted, handled down, standing up within the bull horns. Also interesting at Minoan Crete are the finds of the snake goddess, a woman holding the snakes. For the Greeks in general, snakes are not scary. They didn't start off with a story from Genesis and come to see snakes as something evil. Snakes, in fact, are good, and I'll get to that in a moment. But is this figure, which you see, figure 4.5 in your book, a mother goddess? Is it related to fertility? Snakes are a symbol of life. They are chthonic, and you'll hear that term a few times in this lecture. The word chthon in Greek is one of the Greek words for earth. Snakes are very much part of the earth. They closely associated with the earth. They are a symbol of rebirth with their skins. In Greek thought, health and wealth come from below. Of course, this is later Greek thought, but we're using it to reflect on this. A word for wealth is plutos in Greek, which is related to the word for the god Pluto. Pluto is another name for Hades, the god of the underworld. But Hades, for the Greeks, is not evil. He's the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, and he is the giver of good things. Good things come from the earth, food. Thus, with Minoan Crete, we see an emphasis on female deities. There are cave sanctuaries having the double axe symbol. And the scholar Burkert notes that this is always associated with the female figurines. And I have here again, once more, a note on bull cult. writing was found in the ancient Aegean, some dating as early as 1800 BC are written in a script known as Linear A, and these documents were found on Crete at Knossos and at Hagia Triada. Unfortunately, the language written in Linear A has never been deciphered. It is thought to be the language of Minoan Crete. Linear B is a similar script dating a little later that has been deciphered. As it turns out, these texts written in Linear B are Greek, are written conveying the Greek language. And at least 4,000 tablets have been discovered, mainly dealing with business, just as at Sumeria, writing was originally for the purpose of business. Now, Linear B writings were found not only on Crete, but on the Greek Peloponnesus, at Mycenae, and at Pylos. There's an interesting comparison that can be made between the Linear B texts from Crete and the Linear B texts from the Greek mainland. Only one slave is noted in the Cretan finds, and only priestesses are mentioned, with one exception. That's from Crete. But as far as those found on the mainland, in the Pylos find, on the Greek mainland, 100 plus male and female slaves are mentioned, and priest, masculine, appears more frequently. Thus, even in Linear B and written in Greek, the Cretan texts reflect more of the feminine or divine feminine interests, whereas the Indo-European base over on the Greek mainland mentions slaves much more often, and the masculine priest. An interesting comparison. By about 1585 BC, it is clear that a new culture has emerged, Mycenaean civilization. And this slide looks at the early Mycenaean age, which continues up until about the fall of Minoan Crete. And the chief architectural achievement at this time are the tholos tombs, the beehive tombs, the circular underground tombs. About 9 have been found at Mycenae, including the very famous treasury of Atreus. Now, the power center of these Mycenaean Greeks was on the Greek Peloponnesus, especially at Mycenae. It was these Greeks who eventually took over Crete without a struggle. Later on, the chief symbol of this militaristic civilization will be the fortress palace, and we'll get to that period soon. Now, who exactly are these Mycenaean Greek-speaking peoples? Well, they are certainly a branch of the Indo-European linguistic cultural tradition. They were seafaring traders and pirates. Eventually, they had very economically powerful palace-based economies. These palaces could also be termed fortress palaces. The Mycenaeans are a martial culture, warlike. They have the bow and arrow. This is the Bronze Age, so they are a Bronze Age culture. In fact, traded in bronze and pottery with the Near East. Very importantly for the humanities, the Mycenaean Greeks are the source of legends and myths for later archaic and classical Greece, including for Homer. We have seen this diagram before, but mostly to talk about the lower image. The upper image is the treasury of Atreus. This beehive tomb, hollow inside, 48 feet in diameter and 43 feet high. It is the largest dome until much, much later, about 1,500 years later, when the Romans build the Pantheon. It will exceed the size of the dome of this tomb. The bronze rosettes were placed in the ceiling, perhaps giving it the dome of heaven look. In fact, that's probably likely, and we will follow that theme as well through part of the rest of this course. One of the lintels over a doorway in the treasury of Atreus weighs 120 tons. This is an Indo-European culture and carries with it the tradition of an interest in the horse and horse sacrifice. Here is a horse burial near a Tholos tomb on the Greek mainland. Another phase of Mycenaean Greece occurs with the decline of the Tholos tomb and the emergence of the great palaces that are fortress, civic, commercial centers with associated workshops and storage facilities. In fact, the palace appears to be a development of that central megaron, that central big house that goes back perhaps all the way to the Dameni culture. One of the most notable structures of the Mycenaean period, located at Mycenae, is the Lion Gate. Quote, the oldest piece of monumental sculpture in Europe, with the lions rampant, that is kind of angled upward, and in between the two lions, a Minoan column. Now, these lions used to have metal heads, probably bronze, but someone else at some point needed the bronze, so the heads are gone. But this is at the entrance of the Mycenae Cemetery, including the area of the royal tombs of Circle A, those more ancient shaft graves. Note the immense lintel. We have already seen this slide on a previous presentation, but it's important to note it here as well. The Dark Age, wherein about the time of the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, a general collapse of civilization occurs across the Mediterranean area and the Near East. We have the collapse of cities such as Thebes and Mycenae and Pylos. Linear B disappearing. The Greeks will have to relearn writing all over. Troy collapses, and of course this is about the time of the Trojan War, and perhaps that war played a part in the collapse of Troy. And of course there are the other major events that occurred at this time, including the shift to iron technology, thus ushering in the Iron Age. The Trojan War as given in the Iliad and the Odyssey, introduces us to a number of people that are regarded as heroes. And at this time I want to present a major section on the Greek hero, because it is actually quite important to the future of Western culture, especially even as it touches on Christianity. In the great myths and legends of the Greeks are many heroes, and prominent among all is Heracles, in Latin Hercules, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene. He's famous for his 12 labors, which he did on behalf of humanity. He's called the averter of evil. He wore the lion's pelt, interestingly, much as Gilgamesh did, and carried a famous club. Later Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers prized him for his endurance. He conquered the underworld. After death, he was elevated to the fellowship of the Olympians. He has no tomb, which is rare for a hero, because he is the universal hero among the Greeks. No local place, in a sense, owns him. Another well-known hero is Aesculapius, who was the son of the god Apollo and the mortal woman Coronis. He, in fact, grew in popularity a little bit later in Greek times, into the time of early Christianity. He healed the sick, it is said, and raised the dead. In fact, he got in trouble for raising the dead. His temples were centers of healing, and he was considered kind and benevolent. Then there's Perseus, who is associated with Mycenae. Achilles, a hero of the Trojan War. Odysseus, another hero of the Trojan War. He was the one that planned out the Trojan horse strategy, and he is known in the Odyssey for his successful return home, his nostos, and we'll look at that term more closely. There's Oedipus, who's famous in the Greek tragedies, and Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, who retrieved the Golden Fleece. The Greeks have many, many more heroes, but this just gives you a sample of some of them. Here are a number of terms for hero culture. These are all Greek, and they will be important as we go through this material. Athlos is both the struggle and the prize one might attain in the struggle. It is related to our word athlete, which is from the Greek athletes, one who competes. Agon, contest, from which we get the word agony, and in drama, protagonist and antagonist. Kleos, which means fame and glory. Nostos, the successful return home. Pasco, to suffer, from which our word passion. And hupomene, endurance. Now there are other Greek terms that are related to these concepts. We can't cover them all, but this is a solid group to keep in mind. The Greeks were really into contests, and 4 major groups of people who competed were, obviously, the warriors on the battlefield. Athletes, who in a sense through games imitate the warriors. Note the martial character of traditional athletics. For example, in the Olympics, the javelin. Many of the early Olympic events can be related to military feats. Dramatists, the playwrights of the tragedies, and those in the drama as well, those who perform. And rhapsodes, poets. All these could win prizes in contests in ancient Greece. The heroic code is basically found in Aeschylus's play Agamemnon. Learning comes through suffering, pathemathos in Greek. And we can find a similar sentiment in Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonus, wherein Oedipus says, "My sufferings have taught me to endure." This relationship between suffering and learning. Because heroes suffer. And we note the same basic language found in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament concerning Jesus. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And we can see the root words of pathemathos. Indeed, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the heroic code and heroic sentiments are found in a number of places in the New Testament. Here are the first lines from the Odyssey. "Tell me, Muse, of the man of many devices, driven far astray after he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. Many were the men whose cities he saw, in whose minds he learned, and many the woes he suffered in his heart upon the sea, seeking to win his own life and the return of his comrades." As was noted before, Heracles is the hero par excellence for the Greeks. And here is a much later writer, Diodorus Siculus, an historian, who writes, "Now it is an excellent thing, methinks, as all men of understanding must agree, to receive in exchange for mortal labors and immortal fame. In the case of Heracles, for instance, it is generally agreed that during the whole time which he spent among men, he submitted to great and continuous labors and perils willingly, in order that he might confer benefits upon the race of men and thereby gain immortality. And likewise in the case of other great and good men, some have obtained to heroic honors, and others to honors equal to the divine. And all have been thought to be worthy of great praise, since history immortalizes their achievements." We see in this quote from Diodorus that, again, the heroic goal of immortal fame through labors and suffering, and the elevation of individuals to heroic honors, and to perhaps even to honors greater. Of course, hero is understood as, at least eventually, semi-divine. Jesus spoke of suffering, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days
Here's
rise
an excerpt
again.
from
Suffer many things is expressly the language of the heroes,
known as First Clement,
especially of
It's
Odysseus.
often attributed to
Suffer
Clement,
many
one of
things, I
the
believe,
leaders of the Church at
is
Rome,
expression,
and
and
it
it
is
is
only
dated
found
somewhere around AD 96.
in,
That is about the time that John
the
was
Gospels
receiving the
and
Apocalypse
in
on the island of Patmos.
the Odyssey.
This is a very early Christian
If you go
writing
to the
that is
next
not
slide,
found in the New
note
Testament.
further emphasis on
Clement,
suffering.
the Son of Man,
may
should
be
suffer many
the
things.
same person mentioned
The one who
in
endures
Paul's
to
letter
the
to
end,
the Philippians.
he will be saved.
It is
By
a
your
significant
endurance,
text.
you will gain
Certainly
your souls.
is a window into
So
the
this
world
is very much
of
in
the
line
earliest Christians.
with the culture
And note
of the
the
time.
heroic language. This was a letter, by the way, written from the congregation or elders at Rome to the church at Corinth. "Let us come to those who contended in the days nearest to us. Let us take the noble examples of our own generation. Through jealousy and envy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church were persecuted and contended unto death. Let us set before our eyes the good apostles. Peter, who because of unrighteous jealousy suffered not one or two, but many trials, and having thus given his testimony, went to the glorious place which was his due. Through jealousy and strife, Paul showed the way to the prize of endurance. 7 times he was in bond, he was exiled, he was stoned, he was a herald both in the east and in the west. He gained the noble fame, kleos, of his faith, and was the greatest example of endurance. All of this thus far is to note that even the New Testament and early Christianity owes something to the language of the Greek hero. Hero cult in Greece involved 4 important components, and here they are listed, and I always test on these. First, the dead hero, and remember, it's the dead hero that becomes so important. First, the hero receives a proper burial and lamentation. Then, often games are associated with the hero. The Olympic Games, in fact, though often noted to honor Zeus, in fact began as games honoring a hero. And in the Iliad, after Patroclus dies, that is Achilles' companion, games are held, funerary games. And then the hero also receives epos, that is the singing of his deeds, which gives him eternal kleos, or fame. We get our word epic from this, and thus epic poetry. The poetry, in fact, of Homer. And finally, annual feasting to honor the hero. Heroes are, thus, the powerful dead, usually associated with a tomb or a shrine. They were closer to humans than the gods, and thus appreciated often more. The gods, let's say, as presented in the Odyssey or the Iliad, are often capricious. But heroes are part human and, in fact, suffer just like regular humans do. On the Greek chain of being, heroes are semi-divine, and thus higher than regular humans, but lower than full deities. Now, focusing more narrowly on epic poetry, which is part of hero cult, and remember, cult just means system of worship or service of worship.
The importance of Homer's
sung
works
by a bard
to Greek culture cannot be overestimated.
And epic poetry
the first
usually
one we will
drew
look at here
on
is the Iliad.
the legends
Its
of
theme is the
Xenian
rage
times,
of
far in the
Achilles.
past, by the time we get
covers
to Homer.
part of the battle of
There were, in
Ilium.
fact,
Ilium is
many
another name
epic
for Troy,
poems
and
that
thus
were collected
it
and
involves
called
the Trojan
the epic
War.
cycle.
It reflects
But
on honor
by far
and
the
shame,
two outstanding
and also on
poems
the
and the
theme
ones
of
that were
hubris, that
by
is
far
pride, even
completely
violent
preserved,
outrage,
are
which
the
for
Iliad
the
and
Greeks
the
was to
Odyssey.
be avoided.
If you go to the next slide,
And finally,
you'll see a list of
we note
poems
that in the
and
Iliad,
the order
women are treated as possessions.
they occur
We've been
in what's
following
known as the epic
a shift
cycle,
culturally,
which gives basically
wherein,
a history of the cosmos from creation
cultures
to the
that
end
elevated
of the heroic age.
perhaps a
But I
divine
put them
feminine
bold,
figure,
number 7 and number 12,
lots
the
of
Iliad
feminine
and the Odyssey,
figurines,
because
and overall
they are by far the two
more
most
peaceful
important,
groups. I think it's fair to say,
even culturally, they're the most
the
important.
shift was toward the
Other poems there,
male-dominated, patriarchal,
just
Indo-European
fragments,
influenced
are retained
cultures.
at best.
And but even when we compare the two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we'll see women treated differently. But this would be, in fact, the low point: women as possessions. Here are the first lines from the Iliad. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many stray souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, Muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. Of course, the Muse here is a goddess, one of the 9 goddesses or 9 muses who oversaw the arts. At one place in
the poem, Achilles has to make a decision, and here is his dilemma. And through this dilemma, we can see the importance of certain concepts to the hero. Now, Achilles' father was mortal, but his mother was an immortal, a goddess. Mother tells me, the immortal goddess Thetis, with her glistening feet, that two fates bear me on to the day of death. If I hold out here and I lay siege to Troy, my journey home, my Nostos, is gone, but my glory, Kleos, never dies. If, on the other hand, I voyage back to the fatherland I love, my pride, my glory dies. True, but the life that's left me will be long. The stroke of death will not come on me quickly. The other great poem attributed to Homer is the Odyssey, which is about the homecoming, the Nostos, of Odysseus. Here, cunning is more important than muscle, although Odysseus is a powerful warrior as well. But recall that it's Odysseus who comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse in the legends of Troy. Lots of suffering here exhibited, and he eventually loses his companions. He tries to save them, but loses them, as we saw in the opening of the poem. And there is an emphasis on the importance of home. I find that this passage, I think a wonderful passage, contrasts strongly with the view of women in the Iliad. And so I'd like to quote it here. He says to Nausicaa, a young woman that has helped rescue him after his great shipwreck, or taking care of him when he came to shore. He says this to her: "And may the good gods give you all your heart desires, husband and house and lasting harmony too. No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts that work as one, despair to their enemies, joy to all their friends, their own best claim to glory." And in fact, his wife Penelope in the Odyssey receives Kleos fame, heroic fame. Thus the Odyssey affirms the creation and life, the Nostos, or homecoming of Odysseus, and the family. It's important at this point to note what the Greek view of the afterlife was, at least in general. And here we're talking around, just to give a general date, 700 BC. We're still before Plato here. And when he went to the underworld, Odysseus met up with Achilles. And we recall Achilles talking about the great immortal or undying fame he will receive for remaining in battle. But he has a different opinion in the Odyssey. "Never try to reconcile me to death, glorious Odysseus. I should choose, so I might live on earth, to serve as the hireling of another, some landless man with hardly enough to live on, rather than to be lord over all the dead that have perished." In fact, in general, there is no concept at this time of going to heaven and having that kind of blessed afterlife. In fact, the general view is that the dead live rather semi-conscious existences in Hades. Finishing up with Homer, it has to be emphasized the important place of Homer's poems in Greco-Roman education. Of course, the Romans are coming later. It is the foundation of later Greek literacy. The New Testament was written in Greek. And it is a very strong, not just possibility, but probability, that those who authored texts now found in the New Testament at one time in their education worked with Homer's poems, his stories. And then, of course, Homer, throughout the Greco-Roman world, was frequently imitated. The greatest imitation is the Roman author Virgil's Aeneid, which we'll cover when we get to Rome. As was noted before, athletic contests, games, are part of hero cult. The occasion for their establishment is the funeral of a hero.
Again, we can look
to the New
we've
Testament
already noted,
to see in the Iliad
heroic
those
language
games used in ancient Christianity. Paul the Apostle writes, "Do you not know that in a race," he uses the Greek
still
word stadion,
unknown author
all the runners
letter to the
compete,
Hebrews,
wrote, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us,
finally,
let
as
us
far
also
as
lay aside every
comparisons
encumbrance and the sin which so
ancient
easily
Christianity
entangles us,
and hero cult,
and let us run with
have
endurance
this,
the race that is set
passage
before us,
also from
fixing
a
our
second
eyes
century
on Jesus,
document
the author and
about
perfecter
the
of
martyrdom
faith,
of Polycarp.
who for the joy set
Polycarp,
before him endured the
He was
cross,
one of the great
despising
early
the shame,
so-called
and has
fathers
sat
of the
down
church.
at the right hand of the throne of God.
A great
For consider him who has endured such hostility
Orthodox, small
by
o,
sinners against himself,
theologian,
so that you may not grow weary and lose heart.
one of those who
This
helped
passage
formulate
is filled with the
the
language
stand of the great
of the Greek
church.
hero.
For
And
the
finally,
rest
on
of
the next
history.
slide, I'll let you read this for yourself.
He was
The
martyred,
great
and this
defender
was
of the
what
faith
was
in
written.
only the second
Thus
century,
we, at last,
Justin
took
martyr,
up his bones, more precious
only
than precious
within,
stones, and finer than gold, and put them where
90
it was
years
meet.
of the ministry of
There
Paul,
the Lord will permit us to come together according to
this
our
in
our
his
power
apology
in gladness
to
and
the
joy,
Roman emperor.
and celebrate
Apology
the birthday
means
of his
defense.
martyrdom, both in memory
And,
of those who have already
here he
contested,
shows,
and for the practice and training of those whose
how,
fate it shall be.
in a
The
sense,
language of the hero, but also the
nothing
annual
is new,
celebration.
nothing new is being said
of
about Jesus that hadn't already
the
been
martyr,
said about the
who
sons
is
of
in a
Zeus
sense
or Jupiter.
that is
rooted the
somewhat the
heroes.
practice
And I've given you
of
some examples
this
of
annual
this. You can read it
celebration
on your own.
in Greco-Roman hero cult.
In the second century,
There
at
is
Rome,
some argument to be made
parallels
that
in
what is generally
in
called
some
the
sense
cult
between
of
Jesus
saints or the veneration of
and
saints,
the Greek heroes,
the
were not
Christian
seen as
church
something
as it develops
bad,
going
but is
on
actually
into the
good.
Middle Ages
and in fact,
is at least
one
partially
thinks of
rooted
C.S. Lewis's article,
in ancient
myth
hero
becomes
cult.
fact. Not only
And
did
I
Jesus
showed this
fulfill
one
prophecies,
These are
Old
not
Testament,
Christians outside of
but
the
he
mainstream.
fulfilled also the longing
Those who
that
were followers
the
of
Greco-Roman
students
pagans
and,
had of
people
of
who
the
followed
successor, in a
Polycarp
sense, to Heracles.
were
as
definitely
one
in the
author put it.
mainstream of ancient Christianity and of orthodoxy.
And so
Thus ends this week's presentation dealing with
the heroes and the literature associated with the heroes.
And then comes the Archaic
now
period,
we need to kind of,
which is getting very close to
transitioning
classical Greek.
from,
And here we see
what is gone now,
a number
the Mycenaean age,
the independent
and into
city-states
heading towards
the
classical
makeup Greece.
Greece.
Greece is not a unified
There is a
nation
period
at this time. It is
known as the geometric
a
period,
bunch of independent city-states
begins
that have in
that
common
dark
Greek
age
language,
and continues on
have
to
in
about
common
700
heroic
BC.
and folk themes,
It's called geometric
and have in
because
common
of the
certain myths and religious practices.
art, the painting.
But during this time
on the pottery,
is the rise of
bands of
Panhellenism.
decoration covering entire
Pan meaning all,
surfaces, meanders,
and Hellenism
checkers,
referring to the
zigzags,
Greek world.
lozenges.
So there's a movement towards a
That is
closer
the well-known
association of the
geometric
various
period of Greece.
Greek
It is
peoples and
immediately
independent
followed by what
city-states
has
been called the Orientalizing period.
That
That
is
is strengthening at
influence
this time of the
the
concept
East,
of the
namely,
polis. That is the city.
Egypt
The term,
and
though, is polis,
Mesopotamia,
resulting
and other
in
places in the East.
intercommunication among the elite
Lots of
polis.
Greek
That's
colonization
the
at this
plural of
time.
polis. And we still
the Greeks
retain
moved into
the word polis in
what we would call today
Police,
Sicily and southern Italy.
Metropolis,
And it was called Magna Graecia,
Cosmopolis,
and
those
also
words.
to Western Asia Minor, known as Ionia.
During this time, or a little bit before this time, the Olympic Games
this
were
time, the
established, which is a
alphabet is
part of
introduced
Panhellenism.
from the Phoenicians. Recall
Again,
that
the games brought
further,
together
more
the
ancient
various
Mycenaean Greeks
Greek communities.
had a written language. It was Greek, and it was written
There
in
is
linear
the
beat.
rise
That disappeared.
of the importance
That was gone.
of
They
Apollo's
had to learn
oracle
writing
at Delphi.
all over again. And this time, it's an
I'd
alphabet
already noted
introduced by the
Greek
Phoenicians.
colonization occurring,
And the Phoenicians are
very
very
increasing
closely
use of
related
alphabet-based
to
writing.
Hebrews.
And Homer,
Of
the
course,
pottery,
is part
the
of,
painting on the pottery is moving away from
Panhellenism.
abstraction. We're heading
Is,
towards
very popular.
human figures are more clearly
In fact,
and
there's a
realistically
section
human
early
figures
on in the poem
on the pottery. So let's go to the next
where
slide, and you'll see
Homer gives
we've
the
covered this
catalog
before,
of the
but
ships.
he names off
Once
all
again,
the different
the
groups
first four letters of the
Greeks
Hebrew
by
alphabet,
their communities,
and then the Greek alphabet,
who fought
first four
at Troy,
letters.
and thus
In Hebrew, it's
all Greeks at
Aleph,
some point would
Bet,
hear Gimel, their,
Dalet,
those
which
representing
corresponds
their
to the
area,
Greek alpha,
participating
beta,
in the Great
gamma,
Trojan War.
delta.
Before moving into the philosophers, I want to make some clarifications concerning the Greek gods. You can basically divide them up into three groups. First are the Olympian deities. These are the deities associated with the sky or mountaintops, and for instance, Zeus, who heads up the Olympian deities. By the way, Greek tradition has the cosmos divided up between three brothers. Zeus was given lordship of the sky and heaven, Poseidon of the seas, and Hades of the underworld. And once again, I note Hades is not an evil deity. Hades is good. Good things come from below. But Olympian deities include Hera, Poseidon, Apollo, Artemis, and especially important to the Athenians is Athena. Then the Greeks recognized a group we call today the chthonic deities. These are deities associated downward with the earth, Greek chthon. And they are associated with fertility and abundance. Plutos means wealth, the good things that come from the earth. And deities here include Hades, Demeter, and Persephone, two goddesses of the famous mystery cult at Eleusis, and Dionysus in his Chthonian manifestation. And these deities, as I note, some of them are associated with the mystery cults. We'll look at the mystery cults more closely when we get to ancient Christianity. The third classification is the heroes, and we've already covered the heroes, who are part human and part divine.
They are associated with the local presence of the powerful dead, usually associated with a local or a location, each hero, except for Heracles, right, who is the universal hero. Almost always associated with a tomb, because heroes are the powerful dead. The greatest is Heracles. On the first slide of this presentation, I noted that with the Greeks we have the movement towards human individualism. And we're now getting to the point where we can begin to see, especially a movement from what has been the past, that is a God-centered or gods-centered existence, and a movement now toward a human-centered world. The Greek philosopher Protagoras famously said, "Man is the measure of all things." And in this light, the Greeks are a major part of the foundation of Western civilization. But not to go down the route of just talking about the Greek genius, we also have to recognize that the Greeks borrowed much that they then built on from the Phoenicians' writing. We'll see when we cover chapter 5 the beginnings of Greek sculpture, really imitation to some extent, certainly great influence from the Egyptians. And then even religious ideas came from elsewhere. But they had their own particular genius and their own particular qualities. It is with the Greeks that the whole endeavor of understanding nature begins. In fact, for instance, our word physics comes from the Greek word physis, which means nature. And we have at this time various philosophers that have been lumped together and called pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic meaning, of course, before Socrates. We'll cover Socrates when we get to the part of Fierro we'll remain covering chapter 5. Although Socrates appears before then. But this is how I want to break everything up. Philosophy means, obviously a Greek term, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Aristotle called the pre-Socratics students of nature. And the pre-Socratics reflected on the cosmos, which is a Greek word. We get our word cosmetic from it. Cosmos means that which is orderly arranged, or arranged in an orderly manner. And they asked things like, what is the basic stuff or material of the cosmos? What unifies the diversity of the cosmos? And in fact, they wanted to account for what goes on in the cosmos. Milesian philosophy refers to the thinking going on in the area of Asia Minor, that western coastal area, at Miletus. As I noted before, the Greeks had colonized that area. They are known as materialists. These thinkers focused on matter. And we really must see this as the beginning of science. Perhaps the most famous among the Milesian philosophers was Thales. And you see his date there. He flourished about 585 BC. That's about exactly that's about the time that Nebuchadnezzar is conquering Jerusalem. Many consider him the first philosopher or first scientist. He is said to have predicted a solar eclipse, which gave him a lot of fame. He asked what underlies
everything, and he felt it was, or he believed it was water. Water is the basic stuff that underlies the cosmos. And then there's Pythagoras, and he is considered an idealist. He did not want to emphasize the material, but the immaterial. And he said that the essence of the cosmos is number. So he put an emphasis on numbers and mathematics. And he was also into music, which traditionally revolves around mathematics and numbers, and into astronomy, and thus the expression, the music of the spheres, the sound that the planets make as they go around for him, the Earth, are all related. Music, astronomy, mathematics. These, by the way, are make up 3/4 of the quadrivium of classical learning. We'll get to that at another time. Pythagoras believed in the immortality of the soul, and it wasn't necessarily the dreadfulness that Achilles in the Odyssey explains. He also believed, interestingly, in repeated incarnations, what we might call reincarnation. Very importantly, Pythagoras believed that the soul is imprisoned in the body. An expression is soma sema. The body is a tomb. That's what that is in Greek. Soma sema. This is very important when we get to Plato. He will be greatly influenced by Pythagoras on this. Pythagoras also believed in a vegetarian existence. Democritus held that the cosmos was made up of atoms, which means it's made up of those things that cannot be divided. That's what atom means. Everything is made up of atoms. Now, he put this out there as an idea. He could not prove this. Eventually, much later, we've come to see this as, in fact, descriptive of the natural world. More on atomism when we get to the philosopher Epicurus. Heraclitus is referred to as the obscure one. Now, he's over at Ephesus, which is on the coast of Asia Minor, and he was a contemporary of Pythagoras. He believed that the cosmos is in a constant state of flux. He said that cannot step into the same river twice. But he also believed in the unity of the cosmos. What keeps together the unity, what holds together the cosmos, though it is in a state of flux? And he said it is fire. Fire is the unifying element. And that God is the universal reason, the logos. That was his term. Interestingly, much later, John will write in his gospel, at the very beginning, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh. Of course, John's meaning for the Logos isn't exactly the same, but Logos is an important concept by this time among the Greeks, and will also be important, for instance, to the Stoic philosophers.